So inmendham. Okay, the thing is, we could still discuss something like the word objective versus the word material, but it's become just semantic. I understand what you mean by objective. And we agree on the basic elements of the suffering, like that there statistically is more material. But it's just a statistical thing. See, fundamentally, I'm not willing to grant, you can do something pleasurable that kills you and leads to suffering, and you can do something that seems like suffering and makes you stronger and leads to greater pleasure. So, okay, but 90% and overall, I'm willing to accept that picture the way we said and put some of the terminology aside, and I think we get to this point of, don't we both agree that pleasures do feel good? Okay, and we agree that the problem is they lead to suffering that is material, what I would call material or objective suffering, right? In other words, there's some kinds of suffering, not a problem. So this is why a society creates a moral system. One of the things it tells you, or you could maybe characterize the whole thing it tells you is, what you're supposed to do in this group, and so it tells you, hey, how about this? Just don't get any pleasure out of something that causes material suffering. And then you and I discuss if that's possible. Is it possible? And that's why I say things like art. If I create art or enjoy a cup of tea on a Sunday morning looking at the sunrise, then how is that going to create material suffering to anybody else? So we can make this not a zero-sum game, because some things are, zero-sum. However much energy in a system, that's how much energy is in the system. You don't get more, you don't lose it, it just moves around. But not everything is conserved that way. Okay. Now the fact that pleasure and suffering seem in this balance, to me, that's because of our biology. We want to seek out and and suffer. And sometimes it's pathetic. There's no material thing to the suffering, and so we have people, but I'm so miserable. I think so bad. Okay, but we're not worrying about that because that's mental, right? So if you can not worry about that and have positives, we're also not worrying about the positives, but they become a reason to live. Now, you still lack an ultimate reason, or that things are ultimately getting better, but this is where there's a profit taking. From birth to death, you get to try to get some pleasure. And if you have less misery in your life of any sort, right, because your own personal subjective misery does count for you personally. So if you keep that low, one way is when you do have suffering, if you see, well, it had to be, we weren't meant to be together, she left, I feel like I'm suffering, but it's not material. So you can discount that and enjoy your pleasures, your time swimming in the friend's pool or something. Then you personally are ahead, and the remaining issue is, did you give more misery to someone else somehow? Did your pleasures indirectly cause other people's misery? Because in that case, we said you're not allowed to just discount other people's, you can only discount your own misery. So is it that possible? Can't we deal with other people this way? Because look, now ultimately in nature we're going to eat animals. Maybe that leads to factory farming, the suffering of their murder. But where do we draw the line? Do we think there's a problem? Is it material, the suffering of a plant to us? Are we going to consider that something we don't want to do? Because it seems to me, if you eat plants and can agree that that's not inducing suffering, and that's entirely possible. A plant doesn't have the central nervous system. Its concept of suffering is different, and for all we know, we don't know, we could look into this, but for a plant species to suffer might be to pollute the environment so that the whole species is dying out or can't prosper. If you raise a tree in an orchard, for all we know, the tree is fine with that. It's not like a regular animal that needs area to roam. If you raise an animal in the wild with free area to roam, then and just hunt it, then that's different than having a factory farm thing, right? Well, with plants, you give it a place to grow, it doesn't want to wander. So if you give it a nice place to grow, it might be fine with that for all we know, and that might not induce suffering. And if that's the case, and I'm going way into extra detail considering most people don't even consider the question of this, but humans can eat and sustain themselves without causing the suffering, material suffering or objective suffering, or whatever you want to call it. And how wouldn't that be a sum total game, right? Because we have to take time into account. The fact that we get time, that's what we get. You know, what are we ahead? Time in the world. Without that, we get no time in the world. It's a zero. So I think that the game here can create this, and there are different dimensions, you know, different factors and axes, analytic uh, axes that you use to analyze things. Now, the pleasure and pain one is this funny one where cognitively we want to find the pains, because if there are material, you know, pains, we want to sense them. Okay. Problem is, when there aren't really any material gains, we still go try to find them. But why also can't we claim, or I claim, that we've grown out of that potentially? Because some of us see that. We see that, and I think even most of us, you know, we see that we're having, you know, pleasures and pains that are immaterial. Sometimes we come to see our pleasure that way, and we try to get something else more substantial. So there you go. Cheers.